If we hear something repeated enough, then we believe it to be true. Whether it's true or not, if you hear it enough times, it becomes the focal point, right? So people hang their hat on that. By the way, I like your hat.
Thank you.
And one of those issues, at least from my perspective, is that we always talk about obesity as the endpoint, that we have this obesity problem. Do we have an obesity problem? Clearly. Is obesity where it starts? No. I don't believe that that's where it starts. And I'm going to explain a little bit about what I mean. We talk about obesity over and over and over again. And it seems to me, and when I say we talk about it, the paradigm, which is a working model by which we construct, that has been constructed, and we believe that that's, what it is. Like, that's how we define it. Everybody has been trying to fix this obesity problem for the last, I don't know, how many years? 50?
Since I've been born, I've heard about it, yes.
Like decades and decades and decades. One of the things is, I think that if we are asking the correct question, after a period of time, we should be able to find a solution to that question. Mm-hmm. If we are asking the wrong question, then the solution is always going to evade us. And that's what's happened with this obesity. Are we over fat? Yeah, but we're under muscled. And skeletal muscle right now is always the periphery. It's never the focal point of a discussion, unless, of course, we're talking about athletics or physique or fitness. Then skeletal muscle, which is the muscle under your voluntary control, it's your bicep and your quad, whatever. That is actually the pinnacle of health and well-being. And it's been completely ignored. For example, when we go into the doctor's office, they'll say, okay, well, your body fat percentage is this. You don't go in and go, okay, well, how strong are you? There's no metrics to assess strength routinely. I mean, I did it as a geriatrician, but in a routine physician's exam, have you ever been to a doc where they assess your strength?
I don't think they did strength. They did body fat. Never strength. I don't even know how do you assess strength. Actually, that's I was going to ask. I mean, what are the numbers? What do you
hand grip strength? They'll say how many times can you sit and stand, walking speed. You're young and healthy. It may not be as relevant for you, but for an older population, it perhaps is relevant. But I think that this constant focus on obesity is wrong. I think that these issues really begin in skeletal muscle decades before. And there's evidence to support that in the literature. And insulin resistance in skeletal muscle, I think, is the pinnacle, not the periphery. And that is an example of a common narrative that we have gotten wrong. We're still trying to correct the obesity problem, which I think is a symptomology of, on one hand, impaired skeletal muscle.
So help me out understand this a little bit more. So about 15, 16 months ago, when my daughter was born, I had you can say a moment of insight where I recognized that I was living a fairly unhealthy life. And I was, because I was not somebody who would go to the gym. I would eat all right, but I wasn't like really looking at my nutrition, none of that stuff. And I grew up in India where we really didn't care. Like, it really didn't matter. And I grew up in also a family which is strictly vegetarian, which is why it's really hard for me. Even now, I can't really eat meat. It's not possible for me psychologically. I can make that shift. And so only about 15 months ago did I come to the awareness of the fact that if I continue my life the way I was living, I'm not going to be able to enjoy my children's adulthood, and my grandchildren's definitely not. Right. And this observation came because I was looking at some of the grandparents of my children, and I was like, I don't want to be like that at 75. Like, I want to be a little bit, actually be able to play with my grandkids if my kids choose to have some, So I was like, this is a big aha moment. And that moment of insight started to change my narrative towards health. And one of the big things that shifted for me was strength training. And it's, again, I don't have the matrix to really know. And that's where my question comes is, so as I started doing it, the only measure that I was taking until now that you mentioned grip strength and all of that, I hadn't considered that, was the measure I was taking is how much more weight am I deadlifting? How much more weight am I squatting? Is that the right measure, or are we talking about something completely different that one must consider?
I think that a strength measure is absolutely important. How much are you squatting? Are you progressing? Especially if you are untrained, then you are going to have exponential increases in weight. And also your body is going to change much more rapidly than someone who has been trained, trained for a very long period of time. Yes, those strength measurements are critical.
So you're saying these are some of the measurements. What would be some of the measures that a person that is listening to this podcast should consider? What are like 4 or 5 things that we should look at?
Squat, bench press, deadlift. I think that those are all very critical. I also think some of the things like how many push-ups can you do? Just so that you can see how strong are you in that position, and what about a 1 mile run if an individual is running? Those are a couple metrics that individuals could and should think about, but then also putting together a program in place and then holding yourself accountable and reevaluating the data. Did you get stronger? Are you running faster? Can you do more push-ups? And if you want to do pull-ups, can you do more pull-ups? Those kinds of things.
Is there a measure where you have, okay, if you're 35 years old, this is what you should be able to do. If you're 45, this is what you should be able to do, or everything is relative to where you are?
I think a better way of thinking about it, so there are standards and there are metrics, and it's typically based on untrained versus trained individuals. And then there's an athletic population and, athletic and elite population. But I think it's very individual. And of course, it depends on the kind of training that the individual has done, right? So for example, my husband, who's been well-trained his whole life, I'd love to see him run, right? There are other ways in which we can think about physical strength, also improving mitochondria function, which would be cardiovascular types of activities. So yes, is it mostly related to age? Not necessarily.
So our audience is either life coaches, health coaches, or they tend to be business coaches. These are typically the people that we engage with in this particular podcast. And we have a larger audience at Mind Valley that engages with individuals that are doing things. But with this particular podcast, Master Coaching Podcast, that's our focal point. If there was somebody, and I can attest to most of the stuff that you're saying, because just in 15 months, I can see how much I have changed, and people who have followed me have gone, Ajit, you look different. You don't only feel, of course I feel completely different as a person, but how I even look different to the outside world is amazing and magnetic. And at the same point in time, I feel like the biggest struggle for me when I started was to get into that mode, especially for an untrained person. Like I've never done that until the point. Is there something that you found? Because we were also briefly talking about, it's not only about building muscle strength, it's also about how you approach that change.
Yeah, and we were chatting before, and there's a couple things to address that point. Number one is you're never going to feel ready to probably do anything that is going to make you uncomfortable. There is a level of friction that is going to happen as you are starting something new, whether it is business, health coaching, life coaching. There's initial friction. For you, you may have not wanted to start training, and there was probably friction, right? Like, do I have to do it? Am I going to do it? Having yourself be held accountable by somebody other than yourself can be very valuable, especially if it's a new physical skill. Having a trainer or somebody is very valuable. I'm sure there are fitness professionals listening, and they would appreciate me saying that, but it is absolutely true. And also knowing that you're going to start before you're ready. And probably the biggest thing is knowing your own personal weaknesses.
Talk to us more about that. I love that idea.
Everybody focuses on strengths. I know these are my strengths. I can do this. I'm a great runner. I'm going to go keep running. But most people are not attuned to their personal weaknesses. And weaknesses are much more valuable to know and have in your back pocket, because then you know where you fail and how to navigate that. And those are the most successful people that I have ever seen in all domains. And the CEOs that I take care of, and we were talking, my husband is a Navy SEAL, the military operators, the war fighters, they are uniquely positioned and have thought a lot about where they fail and what their weaknesses are.
So what you're saying that I'm understanding, and that I think what great that you related it to individuals who are on the battlefield as well, is that because they understand their weaknesses, they know when they will fail.
Absolutely.
And because they know when they will fail, they plan for what they will do when they're about to get into that zone. Is that what?
That's exactly right. And they are never surprised by their own human nature. And how this would relate to someone who's starting on a health and wellness journey. There are going to be days where you don't feel like training. There are going to be days where you know that this is your nutrition plan that you've put in place, but your daughter had a birthday and you're going to eat half the birthday cake. They are never surprised by their own human weaknesses or their own human nature. They plan for it. And they rehearse what they're going to do prior to being in the firing zone. For example, if someone is listening and they know that they have embarked on a new health and wellness journey, but they're traveling, they already have a game plan in place to assure their success. I'll give you an example. Yesterday, so I have two very little children. And I got up really early. Both were screaming, went to the airport, and it's like complete disaster zone in New York for getting on a flight. I knew that I had missed my training session. So on Saturday mornings, I always train. And that's part of the commitment that I've made to myself. And it's part of my protocol and my program. I had planned to get off the plane, go right to the podcast, right after a podcast, go find a place to train. You think I wanted to train? That's the last thing I wanted to do, especially with a book deadline and all those other things. But I packed my workout clothes. I didn't have an excuse. I knew I was going to get to the point where I wasn't going to want to do it. And I may tell myself I'm too tired or I'm not going to do it. No. So I reached out to a friend. I'm like, hey, so I'm landing. I'm going to do this. We're going to train. I planned for it. And did I execute? Yeah, I could barely move this morning.
So tell me a little bit more about that, because I know that's one of those things that we study a lot in the coaching world, is because the biggest challenge that people have a lot of the times is not that they don't know what to do, but it's more about not being able to do what they know they should be doing. If we ask anybody after this podcast, they'll be like, absolutely, I should strength train, and you should too. But will they do it or not is where everything kind of changes.
And that is where it becomes really important to merge the current self with the future self. And if you can collapse those two, you will always make decisions in line with who you want to be, not necessarily who you are at that moment. What does that mean? That means that if you want to be strong for your children and your grandchildren, you have to understand that maybe you're not an athlete and maybe you never wanted to train, and you want to become strong, capable, and resilient, then every action must meet who you are becoming. It's not about waiting for motivation. Motivation may never come. You cannot wait to feel motivated. You cannot plan to start tomorrow or any of those other things. You have to become deeply inspired by who you want to be. And, I was talking to your beautiful wife, and one of the things that has been so profound for me, and an impact that has been so profound for me. So I'm a geriatrician by training. A geriatrician is someone who takes care of people 65 and up and really at the end of life, right? So it's that last decade or so, final decade, 2 decades. And unfortunately or fortunately, I've spent more time than I'd like to at the bedside of people that were dying. It's just not a great situation, and I can't say I particularly liked it. But what I will say is there's one thing more painful than death for people. You know what that is? Oh. Regret. Regret for who they could have been, and it's not just in terms of work. It's the unran marathon. It's the unaccomplished goal. It's the thing that I could have written a book, but I never did. It's all these little things. And so the regret is really, at the end of life, what I have seen to be more painful than the actual death in and of itself. So you're like, well, why are we talking about that? Because if you know that nobody gets out alive, unfortunately, last time I checked, nobody gets out of this life alive. And if we don't have that end in mind, then we're much more likely to put off the actual execution of the thing that is going to make us globally strong and fulfill our potential. And by understanding that we all have an end and that there is a certain level of urgency that needs to happen, then you'll practice and you'll think about it and you'll execute sooner rather than later. Because there is a point in time where that gap closes. And who you want to become will always be in the future. So if you can close the gap between who you want to become and who you are and make decisions every day on who that person is, on who has the qualities and the grit and the resilience and the personality of the person you want to become, and you execute on that, like what would that person do? You'll close that gap.
So the first step would be to actually know who you are becoming.
Yeah.
Yeah. And once you know who you're becoming, to see what is it that needs to happen on a daily basis for you to realize that person every single day. Would you say
exactly?
That's
what are the qualities?
Thing,
what are the attributes? And understand that needs to be executed on. If you act in accordance with who you are, then you will always be that person. Rather than if you act in accordance with who you want to become and what are the characteristics and the attributes of that person you want to become, and you focus on acting on that, then you have a chance to closing the gap between who you are and your future self.
Beautiful, beautiful. And could you, and I'm just speaking more to it, and I totally love that concept, and I think it's very, very true and fair, and I think that was kind of an example of also what probably happened for me in that moment of insight, is where I know who I am becoming to live the best of my life, even at the age that most people will be like, oh, now, it's a different way of living life. And maybe that's where my trigger happened. And what I want to know is, if you, in your experience, you've found something specifically that gets people to stay in action on a day-to-day basis. And the reason why I asked that question is, while there is that gap that you're talking about and the ambition to bridge that gap, what I found myself in is sometimes I'll fall for the trap of the immediate gratification, which is our
But you know that you're going to do that.
Yes.
Right? So now you know that is your human nature. So you should be able to plan for that, because it's going to happen tomorrow. Sunday, maybe it happened today. But you know that that's going to happen, so you better plan for that.
So you plan for that by creating, what am I going to do if it happens? Or
Absolutely.
I won't let it happen.
No. You are going to have the urges that is going to happen. You need to plan for all of that. So for example, next week, okay, so if you know yourself, maybe you follow a program for, 6 weeks at a time. Is that true? Do you have a length of time where you'll execute?
I don't want to always say about my experience, because I'm actually very diligent. So once I say I'm going to do it, there's very little you can do to
so you
not
know
have
yourself.
me do it. Yeah.
So for you, I would leverage that quality and say, okay, what's the next thing that you're going to do?
Yeah.
Before you get bored of this thing, what's the next thing?
Yeah.
That's a trigger for you. So if you say you're going to go run a marathon, man, we better pick that marathon. We got to get you training.
Yeah.
Because you know that you are that person. And it's not just about leveraging your weaknesses, which is really important, but it's also about putting a plan of action in place. For example,
This is brilliant, by the way. I'm loving this.
Thank you. I hate getting up early in training. I have 2 little children and a man-child at home who's in residence. He's a Navy SEAL. He's in med school, and I've been working on this book manuscript. I do not want to get up at 5 in the morning. So what do? I put parameters in place that I know I'm going to have to get up at 5, and I am meeting someone at the gym by 6:45. I've already paid for it 3 months in advance. I'm doing it. I'm not going to be that person that doesn't do it. So I've already put things into place and deadlines into place that I am going to have to execute on.
How does one find their weaknesses in case they're not self-aware enough yet?
It's been habitual. Right? It's not something that just started. You have to go back and you have to look at everything. And actually pain is a much bigger driver than pleasure. The avoidance of pain is a much bigger driver. And I guarantee you, everybody has something that they wish they had done or they wish they had done better. Whether it's a play in high school, or they never tried out for the soccer team, or they tried out and they failed because they didn't prep appropriately. Find out what that thing was. And there's likely multiple domains of that, because it is an underlying current. It's an operating system. You have to uncover that operating system, and it definitely comes in patterns, and you expose that. And you know what? It kind of sucks. And if you are unwilling to do that, then ask the people closest to you, because they know it. I guarantee you they will know what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, what the BS habits that you have, what you are telling yourself, and also what buttons to push to get the best out of yourself. That's really important to know.
Yeah, 100%. And we say that, and when you're creating self-awareness, don't only think about self-awareness of you knowing yourself, but ask people around you, so you actually know, okay, this is how I actually show up in the world.
Totally.
And once you know that, it's much easier for you to calibrate around that. Like you said, you know exactly what your weaknesses are. You work around those weaknesses.
Yeah, and the other kind of cylinder of this conversation is that people think, or many people believe, that self-care and, doing the thing is really about being soft and gentle with yourself and giving yourself grace. There's a lot of give yourself grace and give yourself space. I actually think that is a hindrance, and that it actually shackles people.
Talk to me more about that.
Yep. There's kind of this, it seems like there's a lot of polarities. Things swing one way and then they swing the other. And, if we swing towards this way of softness, which I see all the time, I think it really cripples and handicaps people. Rather than embracing the fire, going towards the challenge and know it's going to suck. Mm-hmm. And it could be you don't feel like training, or all of a sudden you've got 50 pounds to lose. Mm-hmm. Or you've had a baby and now it's 2 months later and you're tired, you don't want to do this thing, going towards the thing, or maybe it's the book that you were supposed to write. But rather than distracting yourself with other things and then going to take a warm bubble bath, that's not what somebody needs to cultivate the best version of themselves. The best version of themselves are cultivated within the arena. And understanding that the discomfort and the friction that an individual feels is not because they shouldn't be doing it, but precisely because they should.
So I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but there was a research that I was doing because, like I said, I'm very interested in helping people be able to actually stick to something, because most people want to, somewhere in their heart, they're not able to find their trigger, if you may say. So one of the studies that I was reading about and that I'm testing out with one of my groups right now is to say that yes, and when we put ourselves through a hard task, like stick to something, and we don't give ourselves space, it can cause frustration. And because of frustration, you start to give up on the goal itself, because you feel like, I'm not going to get this anyway, so I'm going to quit. And an alternative model, and I want to hear your thoughts on that. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. An alternative model that somebody suggested is that instead of saying you're going to, it's not necessarily giving yourself grace in the sense you said, go take a bubble bath. It's more giving grace in the sense of saying you decide you're going to train 3 times a week, let's say, or 2 times a week. Mm-hmm. And instead of deciding I'm going to train at 6:45 in the morning, you say, I'm going to train 2 times a week. Now, it may be at 6:45 or 8:45. It doesn't matter. You can give yourself that grace. And what they found is, because people have that grace, they tend to follow through more because they have the ability to, a little bit more elaborate to that study was, instead of 2 times, you have you can pass up one of the times. Let's say, this is not the perfect example because it was more about if you have 5 things to do, you would say you can skip it 2 times and you are still okay. And more people tended to do that. So at least do 3 times and so stick to a new habit over an extended period of time. So this was research done over like 2 years or something of who sticks through. Sorry, not 2 years, maybe 2 months or something like that. Extended period of time to actually know if people stick to and complete the task. What are your thoughts on that?
It depends on the person. If that's a person's operating system, then great. As long as that you know that you will be able to get it done, I think that person probably does really well with flexibility. Mm-hmm. I think that it really depends on what the individual's operating system is. Mm-hmm. The other thing is, you said something that I found fascinating, this concept of if they're frustrated, they're going to quit. Mm-hmm. I would agree with you. I see it in my daughter all the time. She's 3 years old. And one of the things that I think about is, how can we build frustration tolerance? because things are going to be frustrating.
Oh, hell yeah.
Exactly. It's not about avoiding the frustration, and it's not about working around a way so that you don't become frustrated. It's about building the discipline to tolerate frustration. And that is something that I think as a culture we could do a much better job. And the way in which I think that we do that is that we place ourselves knowingly in frustrating situations, and we tell ourselves, I'm not going to quit. This is going to suck and you should bring it on. Mm-hmm. And you cultivate that muscle just like you would be in the gym cultivating a squat. So it can be very calculated, a very particular thing, you know, that can be frustrating for an individual, and you do it. And you know it's going to suck, and you still challenge yourself to do it. And you build the muscle to tolerate the frustration. You build your muscle to tolerate boredom. Mm-hmm. And you understand that quitting is not an option.
Mm-hmm. That's very fair. That's a very fair expectation. And do you have a way that you've seen people build tolerance to frustration?
Oh, of course. Writing my own book. Mm-hmm. Writing, and you've written like 4 or 5 books.
3 books,
yeah. There's a frustration in that initial phase of trying to write the book, and that's so frustrating. You know how many times you just want to get up and quit? And the way you do it is you understand that you just sit down and it is, oh my God, totally frustrating. Mm-hmm. Or even with your kids, like how many times do you have to tell them to flush the toilet? You know, just like
simple things. And then,
simple things.
Yeah.
And mitigating the visceral response is really valuable. Mitigating, right? One of the things is we know that as high as you go is as low as you're going to drop. So there, you know, there's a dopamine hit. As high as that dopamine is going to go is as low as it's going to drop. So mitigating the interpretation of the experience of everything being high and low, and making a big deal about things. Mm-hmm. I think if we can mitigate the importance of things in the moment, does that make sense? Right. Yeah. So if I sit down to write this book and I'm making such a big deal in my head, then it's going to increase that frustration, as opposed to, okay, I didn't know what the sentence was. It doesn't have to be a narrative about it or some monologue or dialogue within myself. It's just this thing. I'm going to execute this thing. I'm going to sit it down for 10 minutes and I'm going to build my frustration muscle and I'm going to execute on it. Mm-hmm. And then I'm going to take a 10-minute break and then I'm going to do it again.
Mm-hmm. I so hear you, and you're so right, because I feel it's the same, like you said, it's the same story when you're writing a book, building a muscle, building a business, working with kids. Everywhere in our lives, we are kind of building some version of our frustration muscle. And that's where I'm like, it's an interesting concept. I want to explore this more, if not in this dialogue at some point, because it's one of those things that I still don't have a science to say, hey, how does somebody build that? I think I have a pretty good frustration muscle. I can get through anything. Like
exposure. You build it through exposure and practice.
And how do we mitigate that going into the future? I know this has nothing to do with what you sat down to talk about, but because one of my biggest concerns as a parent is that my kids have an extraordinarily simple life. I had a really tough life as I grew up. I grew up in India in a house of 23 people sharing the same space. So I grew up in, tough circumstances. I have a huge frustration muscle probably because of that, because everything was so frustrating around me. But that doesn't happen anymore because life is incredibly abundant at this point. Not just for me, like generally life is incredibly abundant, even in India at this point. So what is it that you're thinking about, if you're thinking about it at all, is we need to do for the next generation so they can build the frustration muscle? Because I think there's some learning for our generation in that too.
I actually had a great conversation with a friend of mine. His name is Remy Adeleke, and we talked about parenting his 4 kids. And he is a former Navy SEAL. Now he's a writer, producer, amazing. And he grew up very tough. He grew up in the Bronx in New York. And one of the things that we talked about was the concept that the way in which we raise our kids, things aren't going to go right. And no, you don't get a participation trophy. And the reality is it starts with us. It starts with how we model things and how we respond to their experiences. They may not ever have to run through the streets, God willing, right? And I don't want that for them. But there are ways to cultivate some of that strength by just navigating daily life. No, my daughter doesn't get a participation trophy.
But the school gives that here, right? Isn't it?
I mean,
That's where they
I don't
are
know.
so
Who
many
knows?
hours in the day.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? But when you come home, it's, you know, these are the things that you have to do. You can't always get what you want. There are rules and in place in this home. This is how we respect people. This is how we clean things. You know, these are the ways that we do. No, you can't have that toy because you didn't earn your allowance. And she's only 3, but we're starting to work on teaching her these things.
It makes perfect sense. And maybe this is applicable to us ourselves as individuals by putting a reward system within our lives to say, oh, you don't get to do X if you don't do Y or something like that.
Absolutely.
So it kind of automatically builds small, but over time, a big enough muscle.
And how about simply saying, you know what, I really want a coffee, but I'm going to not buy Starbucks for the next week. Even if you can afford it.
Yeah.
But to actually do something that is uncomfortable or a little bit restrictive, I think is very beneficial.
And that might be the way to start building that frustration muscle.
Or
is to just go create restrictions, manufacture them, just so that you could
doing a little bit of a hard thing every day or something, and maybe that's not it, but, you know, saying, oh, gosh, I already worked out once today, but, you know, I'm going to go do 5 sprints and I really don't want to do it. I mean, that's something silly, but it's actually creating a bit of discomfort so that you know that you can tolerate it. And I think that that can be very valuable.
Absolutely. I think it'll be amazing. That, I think, should be a great takeaway from this episode, amongst many other great takeaways, as to how to build frustration muscle. Let's call it that for now. Talking about muscle, I've like I said, I've had great benefits of strength training generally in my life. What have been some of the benefits, or some of the individuals that you've worked with maybe that have had great benefits because they started strength training? I just want to establish the extreme changes that one can expect. It's very extreme in my life, but sometimes it's hard to communicate because how I feel is even way more than how I look or where I am in my journey. Again, I'm very new to all of this, but because you've had so much experience and you work with so many people, I'd love to hear what you have been seeing.
The first thing that I'd like to start with is the top down, and by top I mean head. You don't build physical strength without building mental strength. The two are connected. Muscle is just the modality that's used to build mental strength. Every single person becomes mentally stronger when they become physically stronger. Obviously, there's a gradation of how that is. You know, maybe not everybody is bench pressing 300 pounds. You know, I know I'm not, but to become physically strong requires mental discipline. And that is a change that is profound in every capacity. Okay? So number 1 is mental fortitude and mental strength. Number 2, they have more energy. Just from a very fundamental level, they are empowered mentally because they know that they're capable, physically capable. Number 2, they have more energy to just do the things that they want to do. They find that maybe they don't need that afternoon cup of coffee, or they're waking up with more energy. Their moods are better. We know that muscle affects, and training and exercise affects brain function and mood, which is incredible. Their metabolic markers usually improve, whether it's triglycerides, insulin, blood sugar, all these markers improve. And one thing that is very important is that nothing gets worse. Nothing gets worse the fitter you are. Mm-hmm. That's amazing to think about it. And it's not like, hey, you don't have an injury here or there, but muscle and training is more impactful than any one medication will ever be, because it's our birthright. We were designed to do these things. So the homeostatic mechanisms in place, meaning the things that bring us into balance, are what I believe to be leveraged through skeletal muscle. And it's not solely the physicality. It is also the mental component and the way muscle interfaces with the brain, the immune system, the way it's a nutrient sensing organ, the way that it will improve everything as it relates to longevity and the trajectory of aging is through skeletal muscle. If that's not enough, and it improves survivability in nearly all cause mortality. You are never worse off from having healthy, fit muscle, like ever.
Yeah.
So those are just a few of the experience. But I think the big thing is it creates a discipline, a physical discipline that translates to a mental discipline that ultimately leaves an individual globally strong.
Is there, because I know there's a code that you kind of talk about, which is where we started the conversation, but do you think our fight for obesity must be counteracted today with more, just getting more people to do some strength training?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and you've seen that people change in body fat percentage or
Yes.
whatever other markers just
Yes.
because they're strength training.
Yes.
Yeah, and what's your optimal suggestion? Again, I know it changes person to person, but if optimally somebody's here says I'm a male, 35% body fat, hypothetically, where and how much do I train and what kind of training should I look at? Yeah.
Well, the first thing is obviously we can't ignore dietary influences. You have to manage your calorie intake. You have to prioritize dietary protein. Protein is necessary for the health and maintenance of skeletal muscle. The fitness aspect, I believe that individuals should be training 3 to 4 days a week, resistance training. Focused, dedicated training to hypertrophy, which is simply the growth of muscle, right? And they can go through periods of time where they're focused on strength. Strength is typically not thought about, and I cringe a little bit when I think about these things in isolation because they do intertwine. When you train for strength, you will get a little bit of the muscle growth. Certainly, if you are training for hypertrophy, you will get a little stronger. So I hate to be so divisive in that, but I will say 3 to 4 days a week of dedicated resistance training. And that means not necessarily going to a class and doing it in between. I mean, really dedicating the time to be able to build proper movement patterns, to be able to, again, it's functionality. You want to be able to pick up your kids. Mm-hmm. You want to be able to carry your kids, their diaper bag, both, probably both kids on both arms. So you want to be able to have functional movement that translates over to, being able to carry all that stuff. Strength training, I do think a great cardiovascular base is essential. So that would be lower intensity zone 2, which is so boring. Everyone talks about that. Zone 2 cardiovascular training, which could be 150 minutes a week. Mm-hmm. That'd be cardio training, whether it's 30 minutes a day. Mm-hmm. Doing
cardio training, you mean movement based or running?
Well, last time I ran, I hurt my calf. So no, it could be biking. It could just be some kind of cardiovascular
activity.
And it's nothing crazy. Mm-hmm. It's really working on that cardiovascular system. And again, muscle is an endocrine organ. And when you contract it, whether it's aerobic activity or resistance training, it secretes myokines. And these myokines are proteins. Muscle is an endocrine organ. It secretes myokines that go through the body, that interface with the immune system, that help modulate inflammation, lower inflammation. It creates myokines, go past the blood-brain barrier and improve mood, everything, right? So anyway, not to get sidetracked, but the other thing I think is very valuable that builds both the mental and physical muscle is doing some kind of near max activity. And if you've never done it, I guarantee you're going to try to talk yourself out of it every time you do it. And that's kind of a sprint interval training, which is getting up to 90% your VO2 max, like really all out effort. Totally sucks. Mm-hmm. I recommend people do that once a week or once every 2 weeks.
Okay, so this would be trainings like Orange Theory? Would you say that?
No, it would be 30 seconds of max effort followed by some recovery.
Max effort cardiovascularly, like run like crazy.
Yes.
And then, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It doesn't have to be a run. I used to do it a while ago. I would do some kind of activity. I followed some of the Jim Jones programming, which was amazing. And I did, it was a max row for time, just max out effort. It was, it gave you metrics to meet, whether it was 30 seconds or a minute of minutes, probably too much, of really high intense output, sustained activity.
Okay, I understand.
And that takes like a very much mental focus, and nobody is like, I can't wait because it hurts, right? No one's like, I can't wait to do that. But again, also working with a trainer, not doing this by yourself.
Yeah, 100%. I was about to say, I understand.
I don't do that
I was like, I understand why my trainer would put me through hell once in a while. That was that training. And I was like, why? why am I doing this? And
Exactly.
I used to hate her so much.
Right.
for
And
it.
you wanted to quit. And you're like, this was the worst idea I absolutely have had in the
Why
last
are
10
we
years.
doing this?
That's perfect.
Yeah.
So you probably did it.
Yeah. No, did it because she would not. She was like, no, today is that day
Yeah,
and it's
of
going to
course.
suck. And I'm telling you it's going to
Totally.
suck and you hate today's.
Perfect.
But today's the day we are doing this.
Perfect.
And she would not tell me. So because she knew I will be like, oh, I'm busy today.
Exactly.
This is
like I just
oh, no,
actually
today's that
can't
day.
make that training session.
Yeah. She's like, no. It's
Exactly.
not.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That would be a great place to start. 3 to 4 days a week of targeted resistance training. Doesn't have to be anything fancy. Cardiovascular activity that's somewhat easy. And then 1 day a week, and then one small chunk, it could be 2% of your training volume. Very small. 2 to 4% of your training volume. Very, that high intensity, that max effort makes your body more efficient.
100%. We have a training protocol called 10X that is very much based on resistance training that you're talking about, which was my gateway to get started. That's what really got me into that rhythm because it's easy to follow. It's not overly complicated and we could really get it done. Even starting wise, you could just do it with the app. Literally, we have a quest for it where you could just follow along and get it done. So that was great. And that the nuance I wanted to add to it, or at least ask about, was one of my other friends said that instead of doing high intensity cardio training, you just should go for long walks.
Yeah.
There's any truth to that or no?
No.
Okay.
And you have to understand the stimulus and the input is going to equal the output. There are multiple systems at work, multiple different times, and the benefit that you are going to get from putting in that intense effort is going to be different. Just the metabolic systems are different.
Okay.
And there's no free lunch and there's no shortcut and there's no hack. The hack is focused, intense exercise. There's your hack. The harder you can go, the shorter it's going to be and the more it's going to hurt, but you'll get the job done.
And is it, you said 3 to 4 times do resistance training, go maybe once a week all out, and the other ones are cardiovascular activity. So you're saying you should train every single day in one way or another.
I do believe that movement single day is very valuable. Of course, you do have to listen to your body. Not tell yourself that you're not going to train, but listen to your body. And, if you need a rest and recovery day, totally fine.
So, but do you recommend a rest and recovery day, or are you saying it's completely person to person? So look at it in your life, or?
I think it depends on the training. If someone feels and thinks they're putting in a lot of effort, but they're not really, they probably don't need a day off. Because can you calculate how many days off that would be in a year? So if you calculate 1 day a week, so that's what?
52 days in a year.
I mean,
that's like 1.5 months, almost a month. Yeah.
So if you're not putting in effort, and maybe your effort is pretty low, then why would you be taking a day off?
Yeah, that's true.
I would just recommend training at an intensity that is meaningful and then earning that day off.
Yeah, so train with a trainer. Usually they would.
I definitely recommend training.
If they have listened to your work and all the stuff that you talked about, hopefully they would. And again, I don't want to nuance it just so that I know that I'm not saying something wrong here. But one of the philosophies that I've learned about and we were practicing in my training was that you're always trying to do better than yesterday in a way. So it's not that you're saying, oh, if I was doing squat for, say, 120 pounds, you're trying to do 125 next time and 130 the next time, unless it is like, okay, you can do it and then you need some time to get over.
Absolutely. You are trying to improve. And, there's certain training programs where you're going to be focused on strength. Yeah. And there are going to be other training programs where you're focused on hypertrophy, and maybe you're not focused on strength, and maybe you're not increasing the weight, but you're increasing the volume. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Or you're increasing the time under tension. There are multiple ways to improve your overall fitness, and it doesn't just have to be increasing the weight. So that's right. That's absolutely right.
Perfect. Anything that I should have asked you, Gabrielle, that I didn't?
No, I am thrilled to be able to talk about some of the aspects of training which are more mental and less physical. I feel like it's really a privilege to be able to do that. So I really appreciate those questions. Oh,
thank you very much. This is one of those things that has transformed my life so much in the past just a year and a half that I couldn't recommend more. Anybody, if they come to me like, all the training you could do later. Just work on your body first, and you'll see everything else kind of just falls. Like you said, if you can get yourself to do the hard thing, the thing that you've trained most is your mind, because
I agree.
you are able to find your weakness, work around them, or be able to still do things even if you're like going, I don't really want to do it. That's huge, I think, in any area of our life. Where can people find more about you? What is it that we can learn from you more?
I have recently launched a podcast, by the way, and it's called, shockingly, the Dr. Gabrielle Lyon Show, just so that people could find it. And an episode comes out every Tuesday. I also have a YouTube channel and a newsletter that is free and curated of interesting studies that are coming out or things that I think are really valuable. And I also, I have a website, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, and people can apply to be a patient. Actually, I have a whole team. I have a great physician assistant, Colleen, and we have a full-time physician named Dr. Brian Stepanenko, former military, and we have 2 health coaches, Peter and Alexia. We have a whole team.
That's amazing.
That are amazing. They can
and is it
apply.
accessible to anyone
Everybody.
that wants to work with you?
It is throughout the whole world. We have patients all over the world.
It's amazing.
It's all remote right now, and they can go to my website, drgabriellelyon.com, to apply to be a patient. And then, of course, they can find me on Instagram, Twitter.
That's awesome. We'll link up everything below wherever we post this episode. So the spelling and everything, you will have a link in the show notes. Please go and look at these websites. Thank you so much for coming in today.
My pleasure.
It was a pleasure talking to you.